The cold wind whistled through the streets of Chicago, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts and the distant melodies of Christmas carols. Bright lights and festive decorations lined the sidewalks, a sharp contrast to the gray sky and the bitter chill that filled the air. Billy, a 10-year-old boy with messy brown hair and eyes that held more wisdom than his years, sat curled up in the doorway of a closed department store. His thin jacket barely kept the cold away, and he pulled his beanie down lower over his ears. His breath came out in small white clouds as he huddled deeper into his makeshift shelter. He was alone. The bustling Christmas Eve crowd walked past him, their arms filled with gifts, their laughter warm and lively. Families rushed home to their loved ones, while Billy remained on the outside, watching from a world that no longer had a place for him. The streets were his home, and a collection of old cardboard boxes and ragged blankets were his only bed. His only companions were the shadows that stretched through the alleys and the occasional stray cat that crossed his path. Billy had been on his own for as long as he could remember. Memories of a home, of a loving mother, had faded into a distant haze. The streets had taught him how to survive, to find the warmest spots to sleep, the best places to look for leftover food, and the kindest strangers who might spare a coin or a meal. He knew how to read people's faces, to judge who was safe and who wasn't, and when to disappear into the shadows to avoid trouble. But tonight, as the world around him celebrated, the loneliness weighed heavier on his small shoulders. The sight of families hurrying past with excitement in their eyes made his chest ache. He clutched his only possession, a small, stale piece of bread he had found earlier that day. The crust was hard and dry, but it was all he had. He broke off a tiny piece and put it in his mouth, chewing slowly to make it last. The taste was bland, but it was better than nothing. He watched as happy children walked by, their mittened hands clutching candy canes, and their parents guiding them through the snowy streets. Billy longed to be part of that world, to feel warmth and love, but he was just a forgotten boy in a city too busy to notice him. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. The wind howled between the buildings, cutting through his thin layers like ice. He curled into himself, pulling his tattered blanket tighter around his small frame, but it did little to keep the cold out. His fingers were numb, and his stomach growled in protest of the tiny meal. Then, from the shadows, came a soft whimper. Billy lifted his head and scanned the darkness. Two small eyes reflected the glow of the Christmas lights. Slowly, a tiny brown puppy emerged from the alley, its fur matted and thin, its body shivering with cold. Its tail was tucked between its legs, and its dark eyes were filled with hunger and fear. Billy's heart clenched. He recognized that look. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror many times, a silent plea for warmth, for kindness, for someone to care. For a moment, his survival instincts told him to hold on to his bread. It was all he had, and he didn't know when he'd find more food. But as the puppy let out another weak whimper, something in Billy softened. Slowly, he broke off a piece of his precious bread and extended it toward the small creature. The puppy hesitated, its nose twitching as it sniffed the offering. Then, with cautious steps, it crept forward and gently took the bread from Billy's hand. Its small teeth worked at the crust, eating eagerly. The desperate hunger in its eyes faded just a little, replaced with quiet relief. Billy watched the puppy eat, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. It was the first time in a long while that he had shared something with someone. He tore off another piece of bread and gave it to the pup, then another, until his small supply was gone. The puppy, now full, let out a small sigh and curled up next to Billy, pressing its tiny body against his for warmth. Billy hesitated for a moment before gently running his fingers through the pup's scruffy fur. It was dirty and rough, but the comfort it brought was undeniable. A small smile tugged at Billy's lips as he whispered, "I'll call you Buddy." The puppy wagged its tail, as if it understood. Billy pulled the tiny creature closer, feeling its warmth against him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. The city streets were still cold, the festive lights still a reminder of a world that had left him behind, but in that moment, he had found something precious, a friend. Buddy licked Billy's hand, a silent promise that he would stay by his side. And as the night stretched on, with Christmas morning just hours away, Billy closed his eyes, holding on to the little warmth and companionship he had found in the most unexpected place. The first rays of dawn painted the Chicago skyline in hues of pink and orange, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered streets. Billy stirred in his makeshift shelter, his stiff body shivering as he woke to the bitter cold. His arms tightened around Buddy, the small puppy who had found him the night before. The little dog stirred, wagging his tail in greeting before licking Billy's chilled fingers. Billy smiled. He hadn't woken up alone this time. As the city awakened, the sound of cars honking and footsteps crunching against the icy pavement filled the air. Billy sat up, rubbing his hands together for warmth, and glanced down at Buddy. The pup's ears perked up as he sniffed at the air, his tiny body full of energy despite the cold. "We need to find food, Buddy," Billy murmured, his stomach growling as if to agree. He had given his last piece of bread to Buddy the night before, and now they both needed something to eat. Billy pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself and picked up the little pup. Buddy wagged his tail as Billy placed him inside his coat, sharing warmth as they stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk. The city was alive with people going about their morning routines, many rushing past in thick coats and scarves, too busy to notice the small boy and his furry companion. Billy had spent enough time on the streets to know where to look for food. He made his way toward a bakery on the corner, where the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. The warm aroma made his mouth water. He stood near the entrance, watching customers come and go, hoping that someone might spare a piece of food or a coin. A kind-looking woman exited the bakery with a bag full of pastries. Billy hesitated, then took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly. "Do you have any leftovers?" The woman looked down at him, her face showing a flicker of sympathy. She reached into her bag and pulled out a warm croissant. "Here, sweetheart," she said, handing it to him. "Merry Christmas." Billy's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quickly, taking the croissant and breaking it in half. He gave one piece to Buddy, who eagerly nibbled on it, his tail wagging excitedly. The warmth of the food filled Billy's belly, easing the gnawing hunger for a little while. He walked further down the street, wondering where he would go next. He had no real destination, just an endless maze of streets that had become his home. As he wandered, he passed by a park where children were playing in the snow, their laughter filling the air. Billy stopped to watch, his heart aching with a longing he couldn't quite put into words. He had once played like that, hadn't he? Before everything had changed? Before he had become just another invisible face in the crowd? Buddy barked, snapping Billy out of his thoughts. The little dog wagged his tail and tugged on his jacket with his tiny teeth, as if urging him to move forward. Billy chuckled softly. All right, I get it. Let's go." The pair continued down the street until they came across a church with an open door. Inside, the warm glow of candles flickered, and the smell of hot soup wafted through the air. A few other people, men and women dressed in worn clothes, their faces tired from the struggles of life, were lined up inside. Billy hesitated. He had never been inside a church before, at least not that he could remember. But Buddy trotted forward, tail wagging, and Billy had little choice but to follow. An elderly man wearing a thick sweater approached him with a gentle smile. "Come in, son," he said warmly. "We have food and a place to warm up." Billy nodded shyly and stepped inside. The warmth enveloped him immediately, making his frozen fingers tingle as they began to thaw. He found a seat near the back and pulled Buddy into his lap as he watched the volunteers serve steaming bowls of soup to the people in line. When it was his turn, a kind woman handed him a bowl filled to the brim with thick, hearty soup. Billy murmured a thank you and took a seat, savoring the first real meal he had eaten in days. Buddy, too, received a small bowl of scraps, his tail wagging furiously as he ate. As Billy ate, he listened to the quiet chatter around him. Some of the people were talking about a place called Hope Shelter, a refuge for those with nowhere else to go. Billy's ears perked up. A shelter? He had never stayed in one before. The idea of being surrounded by so many people made him nervous, but the thought of having a warm bed, even for just one night, was tempting. The elderly man who had welcomed him earlier approached again. "Son, do you have anywhere to go?" he asked kindly. Billy hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir." The man nodded. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here. They take in children and families. If you'd like, I can walk you there." Billy glanced down at Buddy, who was curled up against his leg, fast asleep. He thought about the cold, the hunger, the endless nights spent alone. Then he thought about the warmth of this place, the kindness he had been shown. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked back up at the man. "Okay." The man smiled and patted his shoulder. "Come on, then." With Buddy tucked safely in his arms, Billy followed the man out into the cold once more. But this time, the streets didn't feel quite as lonely. For the first time in a long while, he had a destination, a glimmer of hope shining in the distance. Billy followed the kind man down the streets of Chicago, his arms wrapped tightly around Buddy to keep both of them warm. The man's name was Mr. Thompson, a volunteer at the church who had seen many people in need over the years. He walked with a steady pace, glancing back at Billy from time to time, making sure he was keeping up. "The shelter isn't too far," Mr. Thompson reassured him. "They'll have a warm bed for you and Buddy." Billy nodded, feeling both nervous and hopeful. He had never stayed in a shelter before. The idea of being around so many strangers made his stomach twist, but the thought of warmth, food, and safety outweighed his fears. When they arrived, Billy looked up at the building in front of him. A large sign above the door read Hope Shelter, painted in warm, inviting colors. The windows glowed with soft light, and through the glass, Billy could see people sitting around tables, eating, talking, and smiling. It looked nothing like the cold and lonely streets he had known for so long. Mr. Thompson placed a gentle hand on Billy's shoulder. "Let's go inside." Billy took a deep breath and stepped through the door, Buddy nestled safely in his arms. Warm air immediately surrounded him, filling his lungs with the comforting smell of fresh bread and soup. A woman with kind eyes and a warm smile approached them. "Welcome," she said gently. "My name is Miss Evans. What's your name?" "Billy," he answered quietly, shifting on his feet. "And this is Buddy." Miss Evans crouched down and extended her hand toward Buddy, who sniffed her fingers before giving them a little lick. She chuckled. "Well, it's nice to meet both of you. Come on, let's get you settled in." She led Billy through the shelter, pointing out different areas. There was a dining hall, a playroom for younger kids, and a quiet area with books and puzzles. They passed a row of small dorms, each with bunk beds and warm blankets. It was simple, but it was more than Billy had in a long time. Miss Evans guided him to one of the rooms. "This will be your space for now. You can rest here, and Buddy can stay with you." Billy placed Buddy on the bed, watching as the puppy sniffed around, wagging his tail. He felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in a long time, he had a real place to sleep, a bed, not a sidewalk or a doorway. "Are you hungry?" Miss Evans asked. Billy nodded quickly. He had eaten some food at the church, but his stomach still growled with hunger. "Come on, let's get you some dinner," she said with a smile. Billy followed her to the dining hall, where the smell of warm food made his mouth water. He picked up a tray and was given a bowl of stew, a roll of bread, and a cup of juice. He found a seat in a corner, and as he took his first bite, warmth spread through his body. It was the best thing he had eaten in weeks. Buddy sat at his feet, happily munching on a small bowl of food that one of the staff members had given him. Billy ate in silence, watching the people around him. There were families, single mothers with children, and older men who looked like they had been through a lot. But despite their struggles, they were talking, laughing, and sharing stories. For the first time in a long time, Billy didn't feel invisible. After dinner, he returned to his room, feeling full and tired. He curled up on the bed, Buddy snuggling against his side. The blankets were warm, the mattress soft. It was different from the hard, cold ground he was used to. Miss Evans checked on him one last time. "If you need anything, just ask," she said. "You're safe here, Billy." Safe. The word felt foreign to him. But as he closed his eyes and listened to Buddy's soft breathing beside him, he believed it might be true. The next morning, Billy woke up to the sound of people moving around outside his room. The sun peeked through the small window, casting a golden glow over the walls. Buddy stretched and let out a little yawn before licking Billy's cheek. Billy sat up, rubbing his eyes. He had slept through the night without waking up to the cold or the fear of someone stealing his things. It was the best sleep he had had in years. After getting dressed, he and Buddy followed the smell of breakfast to the dining hall. There, Miss Evans greeted him with a plate of eggs and toast. "Good morning," she said. "Did you sleep well?" Billy nodded, taking a seat. "Yeah, good," she replied. "We have some activities today if you want to join. There's a reading group and an art class. Or, if you'd rather, you can just spend time with Buddy and explore." Billy hesitated. He wasn't used to having choices. His days had always been about survival, finding food, staying warm, and keeping safe. The idea of sitting in a class, reading or drawing, felt strange. But then he thought about the books he used to read with his mother before she was gone. He had always loved stories. "I'll try the reading group," he said quietly. Miss Evans beamed. "That's wonderful. It starts in an hour. Take your time." After breakfast, Billy followed one of the other kids to the reading room. It was small but cozy, filled with shelves of books. A group of children sat on cushions, listening to an older volunteer read a story. Billy hesitated at the doorway, unsure if he belonged. Buddy nudged his leg, wagging his tail as if encouraging him to go inside. Taking a deep breath, Billy stepped in and sat down. As the story began, he let himself get lost in the words, in the world the book created. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. The days at Hope Shelter turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Billy found himself settling into a rhythm he had never known before, a life where survival wasn't his only focus. He woke up each morning to the smell of warm breakfast, the gentle voices of the staff, and the playful nudging of Buddy, who had grown stronger and happier with each passing day. Billy had always thought of shelters as temporary places, just another stop in his life of uncertainty. But Hope Shelter was different. It wasn't just a place to sleep and eat. It was a place where he could learn, grow, and finally begin to heal from the years of loneliness. Miss Evans, who had taken a special interest in him, made sure he attended the daily reading sessions, where he rediscovered his love for stories. He started helping out in the kitchen, where he learned how to prepare simple meals alongside the other children. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't invisible. He was part of something. One afternoon, Miss Evans approached him while he was reading with Buddy curled up in his lap. "Billy," she said softly, "I've been talking to a family. They're very interested in meeting you." Billy's heart clenched. The idea of a family, of parents, of a home, was something he had forced himself to stop hoping for. It hurt too much to want something that felt impossible. He looked down at Buddy, his fingers running through the dog's soft fur. "I don't know," he said finally. "What if they don't like me?" Miss Evans smiled. "I think they're more worried about whether you'll like them." Billy hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." The next day, Billy sat nervously in the shelter's common room, Buddy curled beside him as they waited. The Smiths, a couple in their early 40s, walked in with warm smiles. Mrs. Smith had kind eyes and a soft voice, and Mr. Smith looked like the type of man who told really bad jokes but meant well. They sat down across from him, giving him space instead of overwhelming him. "We've heard so much about you," Mrs. Smith said gently. "We've been looking for a child to welcome into our home, and Miss Evans told us what a bright and wonderful boy you are." Billy shifted in his seat. He wasn't sure what to say. He had never had anyone say things like that about him before. Mr. Smith leaned forward. "I hear you like to read. What's your favorite book?" Billy hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I like adventure stories. Ones where kids go on journeys." Mr. Smith grinned. "Me too. You know, I have a whole shelf full of adventure books at home. Maybe you could help me pick the best ones." Billy glanced at Miss Evans, who nodded encouragingly. He looked back at the Smiths. They weren't pushing him. They weren't trying to force anything. They were just there. And they were kind. For the first time, Billy allowed himself to think, asterisk maybe star. Over the next few weeks, the Smiths visited the shelter often. They spent time with Billy, taking him out to the park with Buddy, bringing books, playing board games, and slowly, gently, showing him what family could feel like. And then one day, Miss Evans asked him the question. "Billy, the Smiths would like to adopt you. But only if that's what you want." Billy stared at her. He had spent so much of his life not belonging anywhere. But here they were, offering him something he had only dreamed about. "Buddy too?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Evans smiled. "Of course." Billy swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Okay." The day Billy left the shelter, it felt strange. Hope Shelter had been the closest thing to home he had known in years, and saying goodbye was hard. The staff hugged him, the other children waved, and Buddy wagged his tail, sensing the excitement in the air. The Smiths took him to their house, a cozy, warm place with a big window where sunlight streamed in. His new room had a bed with soft blankets, a bookshelf already stocked with stories waiting to be read, and a small dog bed right next to his. Billy stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed. "Is this really mine?" he asked. Mrs. Smith knelt beside him. "Yes, sweetheart. This is your home." Tears welled in Billy's eyes, but for the first time, they weren't from sadness. He bent down and hugged Buddy tightly. "We made it, Buddy," he whispered. Months passed, and Billy settled into his new life. He went to school, made friends, and discovered new things about himself. He loved science, especially animals, and he told Mr. Smith one evening that maybe, just maybe, He wanted to be a veterinarian one day. The Smiths encouraged him, telling him he could be anything he wanted. For the first time, Billy believed them. Buddy remained his loyal companion, always at his side through every new experience. He slept in Billy's room every night, a silent reminder of how far they had come together. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Billy had shared his last piece of bread with Buddy on the cold streets of Chicago, he sat by the warm fireplace in the Smiths' home, a cup of hot chocolate in his hands. Buddy lay curled up beside him, fast asleep. Mrs. Smith came over and wrapped a soft blanket around his shoulders. "Merry Christmas, Billy." Billy looked around at his family, at the home he had never thought he'd have. He smiled. "Merry Christmas." For the first time, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt safe. He felt loved. He felt home.